Hi folks, we're going to give it a second, give you a chance to connect and make sure our connection's okay on our end. Greetings everyone, welcome to the historic Wendover Airfield. I'm Museum Curator Landon Wilkie. So today we're starting a new suite of our live history lesson series. So today we're actually going to be discussing the Manhattan Project, and if you came today hoping to hear all about the 509th Composite Group and the 216th Army Air Force Base Unit that we're training here, today's not your day, but just hold on, don't fret. We'll be, in the next upcoming weeks, we're going to be touring some of those sites like the B-29 hangar and the atomic bomb loading pit, so that you can actually see those sites, and we'll discuss more about the role that Wendover played in this greater history that is the Manhattan Project. So today we're just going to be skimming the surface of this major effort for the United States to create an atomic weapon during World War II. So to start that off, I'm going to mention a little bit about how this science came to be. So in the 1920s and 30s, there were all sorts of physicists and scientists and chemists who were working with these new elements, like uranium, plutonium, etc., these radioactive elements that they had so much to learn about, how they functioned, how they reacted to one another, etc. So let me get my big pointer stick for you here. So one of the big one of the guys who was advanced very early on and was doing a lot of this testing in the early 20s and 30s was Enrico Fermi from Italy. So he was a very good theoretical and applied physicist, and he was working on all this groundbreaking research into these radioactive elements. So building off of his work, we have Otto Hahn, we have Lisa Meitner, and then we have Otto Robert Frisch. They're some of the forerunners in this story. Because where we want to start off with, or the catalyst for creating an atomic weapon, was to have nuclear fission. And these are actually the individuals who discovered that. So Otto Hahn and Lisa Meitner were working in a lab in Berlin, trying to develop this technology, trying to understand these elements and figure out what they were doing. So unfortunately, as we approach 1940, Lisa Meitner, who was Jewish, was actually run out of Germany, and she found herself in Sweden. And so she was working with her nephew, who was also a physicist, who was Otto Frisch. And they continued having correspondence with Otto Hahn, who continued his research and experimenting. And together they were able to, he first performed, and then they helped identify the first confirmed nuclear fission. So there were all sorts of other individuals aside from these guys who were involved in the build-up to having this technology that came out of World War II, but we're just going to address a few of those today. So to demonstrate what nuclear fission is, you can see we have this neutron that's shooting up from the bottom here, and it's actually splitting one of these uranium atoms, and as that splits one atom, that continues into a chain reaction, bursting into other atoms, and that releases, they found, an incredible amount of energy. Now these early on physicists, as World War II was approaching or was already upon them, they realized this energy could be used for a weapon, and that was quite concerning for them. So in 1939, we had a guy named Leo Szilard, who was a physicist who had come from Europe, who had fled from Germany and knew that it was possible Hitler was going to develop atomic weapons, and those might be used against the United States or our allies, and that was something we could not have, because this was going to be such a destructive weapon introduced to warfare. So he got in touch with Albert Einstein. I think we all know him, but he was the leading physicist in the United States at the time, well known. So Szilard wrote this letter for him and used his pull to have Albert Einstein sign this, and they sent it to Franklin Delano Roosevelt to explain Germany could potentially have this technology, here's what it's capable of, and here's what the United States should do to hopefully rectify that situation. So FDR realized this was a real issue, and so from that came the Manhattan Engineering District. So to head up this giant national project, FDR chose General Leslie Groves to run the operation, to be in charge especially of the military operation that would come out of this. So he was a very motivated individual to get his jobs done. He had just come from a large project overseeing the construction of the Pentagon, which was certainly not a small thing to do. So FDR felt he was right for the job. So Groves selected a physicist, a theoretical physicist named J. Robert Oppenheimer, to lead the scientific portion of this national effort to create the first atomic bombs, as he had been studying for a number of years now this idea of nuclear fission and the studies that were coming out of it. So the first thing these guys needed to really have a successful project was a location where they could be based out of, where they could have a headquarters to start developing this technology. So the first survey actually selected Oak City, Utah, which was in Millard County, kind of by Fillmore, to be the original site project for the Manhattan Project. However, they quickly realized that the population was a bit larger than they wanted, and there was also a lot of farmland, which was too productive to take out of the war effort in providing rationing for those at home and abroad. So eventually they settled on a place in New Mexico called Los Alamos. So originally this was a boys' school in New Mexico, but it was in a central location, it was isolated, it was hard to get to. So in 1943, that boys' school held their last official graduation before the government bought out the property and they started using the buildings that were on it, and then they constructed basically their own small city where all these people were going to be coming in to work on everything they needed. So this was a self-contained community. As far as security, they all shared one postal address. P.O. Box 1663 out of Santa Fe, New Mexico is where all the mail was sorted through. Anyone, as far as identification, all of their badges read engineer, because if you start throwing things on there like physicist, people might get suspicious about what level of project you're working on. They had fences that would eventually surround the entire city. They had guards that were constantly patrolling the areas. So it was really under lock and key to get onto this base. But that's obviously what was needed for our project. So this is a sign you'll commonly see, or a phrase that you'll see at all of these Manhattan Project sites during the war. So it says, what you see here, what you do here, what you hear here, when you leave here, let it stay here. So this sign actually came out of Oaks Ridge, Tennessee, which we'll address in a moment. But we even had one of these here in Wendover during our effort with the Manhattan Project. So that was a familiar phrase to anyone caught up in this top secret operation in World War II. So this is kind of an overview of a lot of these sites in the United States concerning the Manhattan Project. So you can see these span the entire country, all sorts of levels of areas that are contributing to the larger aspect of creating these weapons. So we're only going to be talking about a few of them today: Los Alamos, Hanford, Washington, Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and then we'll end up in the Alamogordo Desert. But you can see there was a lot more that went into this than just these major areas that you typically hear about in the history. But in order to be successful, the first thing you actually needed was this uranium ore, which they were going to be refining to create this fissile material that could go into the weapons. So we have a couple of areas in the United States where they were doing some of this mining for uranium ore. Another major area was actually the Belgian Congo in Africa. This is one of their large mining operations. But that was important enough that they were willing to go overseas to acquire this material so they could begin that process. And unfortunately, there were a lot of downfalls if you were working in this area with radioactive materials and in an expedited process where there's probably not a lot of safety regulations. So this affected workers here and abroad, but it all contributed to our overall goal. So this is one of the most recognizable photographs for Oaks Ridge, Tennessee. You can see all these women walking out of the plant. they were pretty much responsible for running most of the entire area, because of course our manpower was limited due to all the men overseas or in other military functions. So women were filling a lot of these slots, actually running these facilities and making sure what was happening was supposed to. So at Oak Ridge, this was called a Gaseous Diffusion Center. So it came to be called K-25 was its coded name. But what happened with this gaseous diffusion is you would have this uranium byproduct in a diffuser, and then you would have two different types of gas that would come in, be injected, and as those went out, that would actually help separate the materials, and it would just go through this process over and over again until they had refined it down to uranium-235, which is what they were going to be using for the little boy bomb that you can see right here beside us. So one of the interesting stories to come out of Oak Ridge is apparently these uranium products they were using were extremely corrosive, so they couldn't just use the regular metals that you would find in pipes and the diffusers. They actually needed nickel plating, because that was one of the few materials that could hold up to the corrosive nature of the uranium. So they actually contracted or commissioned Chrysler, the automobile company, to figure out how to silver plate these diffusers and these other materials with nickel. Because if they didn't, they would have to make all of these materials 100% out of nickel, and that would completely deplete our nickel resources in the United States. So Chrysler came up with a way to do it. It only used 1,000th of what would be used if they constructed the entire thing out of nickel. And by the end of the war, Chrysler created 3,500 of these for the US government. Now, of course, they didn't know what these were going to be used for. They just knew the government needed diffusers, and they were the ones to make them. But they came here to places like Oak Ridge, and that went into the process of refining uranium. So another important area is in Hanford, Washington. This was where the B reactor was located. So this included, this is where they were refining uranium into plutonium-239, which was going to be the fissile material that could be used for other weapons. And they were able to produce a lot more material this way. So we had, by the end of the war, far more plutonium. But this was another of those important sites in the first nuclear reactor of any sort. So after all these leading scientists came together in Los Alamos, they had to figure out how they could actually incorporate these materials into nuclear weapons so that they would go off correctly and produce the kind of yield and explosion they actually wanted. So the first and most simple way to do that was to use a gun-type bomb. So you'll see this looks like our little boy bomb, because that's a diagram of it. So this diagram and this bomb replica actually are from John Coster Moeller, who is a leading nuclear archaeologist. So the way a gun-type bomb works is you have some conventional explosives that are going to fire a uranium projectile down this gun barrel to a uranium target. And once those meet, that's going to make those two subcritical fissile masses go critical. So we have this little diorama here that we can show you with. So this is a little boy replica that shows the internal mechanisms for how the little boy worked. And this was donated by a guy named Clay Perkins, who himself is a physicist, and he's a leading philanthropist and also a historian and avid follower of the Manhattan Project. So you can see, here we have our rings of uranium, and then this would be other rings of uranium. You can see they're hollow. This is actually how they worked. So this projectile would fire down the gun barrel, and that actually meets and goes over top of those rings, and once those combine, that triggers that chain reaction that's going to make it go nuclear, as we would say. Let me sneak out of here. So, one moment. So they figured out that the uranium would work. The issue is we didn't have that much uranium. We'll see if we can get our projector back on. Sorry about that, folks. But the issue with plutonium, which we had more of, is that it spontaneously fissions. So that means that it is constantly shooting out neutrons. So they tried putting this plutonium together in a gun barrel, but as it approaches each other in the gun barrel, it starts that spontaneous fissioning, and it actually pre-detonates because it already reacted and starts a smaller chain reaction that isn't going to work for what they actually need. So they tried some earlier designs called the Thin Man that almost looks, I don't know, like an early guided missile or a torpedo, much smaller in size than either the Little Boy or the Fat Man bomb. So they had to throw that out the window and figure out a new way in which to incorporate plutonium. Just waiting for our projector to come back up, but don't worry, it will. So, one of the ways that was proposed to use this plutonium was actually suggested by, we've got some jets, one moment. I don't know who that visitor was, but they are a loud jet. So supposedly General Groves actually proposed the idea of implosion first, but it was so early on, all the physicists, and in particular the engineers, said, there's no way that's going to work. Because you would have to compress simultaneously all this force so that that plutonium was compacted enough to make that mass of plutonium go critical. Now we have it back on. But eventually, as they continued doing more studies, they realized this is a process that might actually work. So these are the insides of what would come to be known as the Fat Man bomb. So what happened is they actually constructed what were called lenses. There were 32 of these lenses that would extend towards the center of the bomb, and then each one of those lenses has its own detonator. And what happened is all those were supposed to go off simultaneously, igniting this high explosive on the inside, propelling it inward, hence the implosion, and then compressing that core of plutonium until it goes critical. So here we have a neat little diagram of that. It's going to show how it compresses inward. So compared to the gun barrel, where you're just firing this at this and that's going to make it go critical, this was far more advanced and they had to devote a lot more time. So the Manhattan Project really geared all towards this implosion type device and making sure that this would work. Because we didn't have enough uranium for multiple weapons, so we had to figure out how to make this plutonium work so we could actually have those deliverable weapons to use in combat if necessary. So one of the best ways I've heard it explained is if you take a balloon in your hand and you try to compress that, if any of that balloon pops out of your fingers, then that's starting a different chain reaction and it's going to interrupt the actual fission reaction that you want to make the mass go critical. So that's why this was such an engineering feat to make sure everything was coming together as it should. So working out of Los Alamos, beginning in late 1944, they were ready to get testing as some of this new fissile material was coming from Oak Ridge and the Hanford site, and they realized they were ready to begin testing here in the next few months. So in November of 1944, they constructed a base camp, which you'll see on the Facebook page today. We shared a photo of that. But this was 210 miles south of Los Alamos in the Alamogordo Desert. And they chose this site because it was already a designated bombing range, so they didn't have to clear any grazing rights or anything else. And then it was a nice flat area where they could make sure this test went as it should, and so they could observe it. So they realized early on they had to calibrate all of their instruments to see how it was going to work later on for the actual nuclear explosion. So the first thing they did is they put together 100 tons of TNT in this ball that you can see here. And on May 7th, 1945, they actually detonated that to calibrate all their equipment and to practice their sequencing, their timing sequences for the initial nuclear explosion. But supposedly the fireball from this could be seen from 60 miles away. So that is a lot of explosive packed into that area right there. And so the actual Trinity test, Trinity was the code name for this weapon, but the other nickname was the Gadget, because they did not throw the term bomb around lightly. So this came to be known as the Gadget, this implosion core. And what they did is they actually lifted it up onto a 100-foot tall steel tower. And this detonation was set for 5:30 on the morning of July 16th, 1945. They originally planned for it for July 4th, because what a patriotic event that would be to see that explosion. But things got delayed. So July 16th at 5:29 and 45 seconds in the morning, this detonated. It just eviscerated the tower. All that was left was the concrete post at the bottom. And all the sand in the surrounding area was melted, turned green. And now that's actually an element or material called trinitite that's only derived from a nuclear explosion and sand. So they learned a whole lot from testing this explosive, but most importantly, they learned that their design worked. So I certainly encourage you to look up interviews, whether recorded or written, for some of these individuals who were here, because they said, here it is before 6 o'clock in the morning, it's dark, and this goes off. The first thing you feel is actually the heat of the bomb. It feels just like the noonday sun. And everyone who was here in the presence of the test actually was issued welder's glasses, those dark tinted lenses so they wouldn't blind themselves if they happened to look at it. So some of them actually smartly, not looking at the explosion, they would lift their glasses and look at the ground around them, and sure enough, it looked just like the noonday sun was shining on the earth at 6 o'clock in the morning. So what a remarkable feat that would have been. And no doubt, I mean, this was a turning point in history. Now we had effective nuclear weapons. So one of the most common heard quotes you've probably heard came from a later interview with Robert Oppenheimer. But he said, "We knew the world would not be the same. A few people laughed, a few people cried, most people were silent. I remember the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty and impress him. And to impress him, he takes on his multi-armed form and says, 'Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.'" I suppose we all felt that one way or another. So here there are many years and countless hours of effort into making sure this weapon would work had finally arrived. And some of them there was some consternation, because Germany, who they wanted to use it against after fleeing the Nazi regime, had already surrendered just a couple months earlier in April of 1945. But the fact of the matter is we still had our men fighting in the Pacific Islands. We had just lost tens of thousands as they were trying to capture these islands and get closer to Japan, and it was time to end this war, and this was the weapon to do it with. So here's a good example just of how that explosion went. This is an image made by a guy named Alex Wellerstein, but it compares it to the Empire State Building. So you can see in 9 seconds, it already surpassed the height of the Empire State Building. So what an explosion that would have been, and we knew the ultimate power of what these weapons would actually unleash. So on that same day as the Trinity test, July 16th, 1945, in San Francisco, the USS Indianapolis was picking up the nuclear material and components of the Little Boy bomb to take them to Tinian Island in the Marianas, where the 509th Composite Group with their B-29 superfortresses were going to launch their strikes against mainland Japan. So the Indianapolis arrived in Tinian on July 26th, but 4 days later, after it had departed and was making its way for the Philippines, it was sunk by a Japanese submarine, and those who weren't killed in the initial explosion spent up to 5 days in the water, shark-infested waters, and hundreds of them died from exposure, from starvation, dehydration, and shark attacks, unfortunately. So that was the largest single loss of life from a single naval vessel in U.S. history, and that was all because they were wrapped up in this secret Manhattan Project, Most of them didn't even know. I don't know if any of them knew what they were actually delivering to Tinian Island, but they sacrificed their lives so that we could get what we needed to Tinian and help end the war there. So finally we had the components of the little boy there on Tinian, and then we got the Fat Man component as well, some of which were being shipped from Wendover, from Kirtland Air Force Base down south. So you can see this is the little boy loaded in an atomic bomb loading pit, a couple of which we have here on base and will be featured in one of our future videos. So on August 6, 1945, the little boy bomb was loaded into the B-29 named Enola Gay and piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets. You can actually see his name right here on this bomb. So as we all know, they took off that morning and attacked the city of Hiroshima with the little boy bomb, destroying much of the city. And then, not hearing anything from Japan as far as surrender, 3 days later, to show that we had this power and to make them think that we had countless more weapons such as this, on August 9th, 1945, the B-29 boxcar piloted by Charles Sweeney took off and bombed Nagasaki. And within less than a week, Japan had surrendered, and by September 2nd, 1945, well, here's the atomic bomb explosions over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Those are the iconic mushroom clouds that we remember so well. But by September 2nd, 1945, on the USS Missouri, Japan signed the surrender papers, and that effectively ended World War II. So no doubt we can thank the Manhattan Project and all these individuals involved for helping create these weapons with devastating effects, but that were needed during this time to end a war that had been going on for far too long and resulted in too many deaths. So, I mean, again, we only scratched the surface today. We talked about some of the physicists, but there's so many more physicists, scientists, engineers, who all played their own role in making sure these weapons were going to work. We mentioned a few of the women, but in addition to running some of these facilities, there were also quite a few female physicists and scientists involved in some of the higher levels. So again, if you're interested in this topic, I encourage you to go out and find some of these other resources. There's plenty of great documentaries and so many books on the topic, and you can find that specific niche you want. So in upcoming weeks, we're going to mention how Wendover played a role in this by being the training base for the 509th Composite Group, so they'd learn how to drop the atomic bombs, and also the role played by the 216th Army Air Force Base Unit Special, and how they helped make sure that these bombs were combat ready when the time came. So I appreciate you joining us. I don't know if there's any questions. It doesn't look like it. But again, we encourage you to visit our website, wendoverairbase.com. There you can find a link for our gift shop website, our online PX, and you can find some great ways to support the base by buying clothing, accessories, etc. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel if you like what we're doing at Historic Wendover Airfield Museum. And then just a reminder, we are now open for limited hours. We're open Fridays from 11 to 4 and Saturdays from 10 to 5. So if you want to see more of this history in person, please come on out as we begin this reopening process. And thanks everyone for joining us.